Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rhodes to Equity, where there are many paths but one destination. Our conversations unapologetically elevate BIPOC and LGBTQIA plus leadership. I'm your humble host, Dr. Dwight E. Rhodes, and we're thrilled to bring you today's show. From struggle to strength, educational equity and queer identity. Our guest, Dr. André Zarate, is an educator, leader, innovator, and edupreneur. He is the founder of House of Legends, a future school project that centers healing and the needs of students of color who identify as LGBTQIA+. He recently graduated from UPenn's Graduate School of Education. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to Rhodes to Equity for more inspiring conversations with BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ leaders making a difference. Now, let's jump into our conversation with André.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you again so much for having me here on this podcast. I'm so honored to just be a part of it and share my story. My name is Dr. André Zarate. Just starting, it just feels so weird to say that. I am an edupreneur. I have my own consulting business called Tito Dre Dreaming LLC, which really just focuses on working with different queer youth of color and trying to make sure that their voices are heard, but also find spaces where they can dream and imagine themselves in the future. And so that has been the work that I have been doing over the last 3 years. I've also worked on a venture called House of Legends, which again centers queer youth of color as a dream space. It once started as an idea as a new school venture, but have decided that over the past 3 years, I want to think about it as a third space and a counter space to see what kind of places that we can continue to have these conversations and dream together, just outside of the educational space as well as outside of schools. Yeah.
Love that. I love that. And thank you for being here, Doctor.
Yes.
And yes, we're just going to wear that just proudly, because trust me, we know that you've put in the work to wear that. So
Yes.
let's just start. Let's just dive into who you are, and can you share a memory from your early life that shaped who you are today?
Yeah. And so it's so interesting because part of and what we've talked about in the past is around my dissertation work. And
Mhm.
so my dissertation work centers the voices of queer Filipinx youth in their intersections of being both queer and Filipinx, and the way that they use imagination to make sense of their identities. And where that idea came up from is basically how I thought about my own experience in life trying to navigate both identities. And so I say that because I knew very early on when I was younger that I identified as queer. But I was in spaces that didn't acknowledge neither identity. So I was in school, and a lot of what I learned around my Filipinx identity has been centered around my family. But once I entered the school space, I realized that, oh, like they're not really teaching any history related to Filipinx people or our contribution to in the United States. And on top of that, we weren't reading any texts that had Filipinx protagonists or themes related to who we are as people. Even more so when we talk about queerness, definitely was not reading any books that had queer protagonists or queer themes or central ideas around queerness. And so what that led up to was this movement in high school and in college where I felt like I was lost in my identity because I couldn't really ground myself in who I was. And society at the same time was feeding narratives into my brain around how my identity as a queer person was wrong, and that a lot of things about myself forced me to not like myself. And so a lot of this discovery and a lot of the work that I have been doing has been trying to reclaim my identity and make sure that, queer youth of color have the opportunity to do the same.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And that resonates with me as well because, I, struggled with identity. And I heard you say that, you didn't have, like, you knew, right? Well, I knew, but yet I wasn't at a place of self-actualization or self-awareness, right? Where I could go proudly into, the leadership roles, but not, even before I became a leader, just simply navigating the space of being a young middle school teacher, and how would I be perceived if I were out, right?
Mhm.
How would parents respond to me, and all of those types of things. And little did I know, Andre, doctor, little did I know at the time that my my principal was gay, not only gay, but married to a man, like the whole, like, and I spent all those years just like hiding my true identity. So I appreciate you saying that, and giving our audience a little bit of background of how you felt when you were younger.
Yeah, I was gonna also like since you talked about that as being a teacher, I one of the things was I noticed this trend over my entire life where obviously when I was in middle school and high school, I felt like I was closeted in the box, kind of like not really like sharing my
Mm.
identity. But when I got to college, um I got to do my exploration because I was kind of like on my own. I was in a different city. I got to explore the ideas of queerness and talk about it more. But I wanted to resonate because when I became a teacher, so I did 4 years of just being like out and proud. And then the minute I became a teacher, I retreated. Like
Mm.
I noticed myself retreating back in because I wasn't sure how that would be perceived as an educator. And I actually had like boxed myself in for a long time. And I would say it's only within the last 3 or 4 years that I started to feel comfortable again in that identity. I had to like reclaim it. And so it's so interesting that, you're talking about that as an educator, like how we have to like play these roles or we have to navigate our membership in society or wherever we're at. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that because it just made me think about how I had like different phases around the way that I wanted to perceive my own visibility as a queer person.
Yeah, so let's dig into that a little bit, because I'm hearing you say that there are different phases, some ebbs and flows. But help our audience, help me understand better. What were some of those pivotal points that were an aha moment, like where you said, I am not going to wear this mask anymore. Like I am going to walk in my truth, and hell be damned to anyone who doesn't agree with that.
Um, in my third year of teaching, I had an amazing mentor. I was a part of Teach for America Chicago, and we had like I guess we called it MTLDs, where it was like teacher managers. And my manager had noticed that I was being different
Mm.
in conversation with her than I was in the classroom. Like I presented myself differently, and she identified as queer as well. And so she noticed that I was having like these two different things, and she was just like, I wonder what it would look like if you showed up in the classroom as your full authentic self, and what that would mean for you. And so I shared with her that I was like a little uncomfortable with it, and I had a lot of fear around being out and proud in the classroom. And she said this one thing to me that I'll never forget, which is she said to me, well, I just want you to think about someone in the classroom who identifies similarly to you as a queer person, and them knowing that you or thinking that you are, and what kind of message you're sending to students around what does it mean to be queer? And I had like a gasp aha moment because I was starting to recognize that I was messaging that in order for me to survive and to thrive in the school space, I had to hide myself. And it made me change the way I think about or thought about like how I wanted to show up in the classroom. And it took a while. It was not an easy, like, oh, tomorrow I showed up and I told everyone and I put pride flags up and all that. It took me like 3 or 4 more years to get into that space, like, and to get into that comfortability. I did do things little by little, but like I didn't go full on out immediately after that conversation. But I never forget that conversation with her.
Yeah, that's great. And that is extremely powerful, because that's when we think about why we're having these conversations in the first place, is so that hopefully someone takes away the idea that we can live and thrive in our authentic selves. We don't have to wear a mask. We don't have to code switch. We think about all the different taxes that we have to pay. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the federal and state taxes. I'm talking about the black tax, the gay tax,
Mhm.
all of those different identity markers that become an extra expense on our mental, physical, and psychological, all of that well-being. And
Right.
so the idea that I really appreciate your leader who just thought very deeply about the impact that you could have and for you to live and work and like model the expectation. Because yeah, I mean, if somebody might think that we have a lot of, high level, we have a queer person who's in the White House speaking for the president, like
Mhm.
that's the
Yeah.
highest office, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
can always identify at this particular point, we can identify, significant queer leaders, but I still wonder how that translates to the students who are sitting in classrooms and feeling unseen, unheard, unvalued, erased.
Mm.
And so I really appreciate it. But I'd like to know, I heard you say you started doing little things. Can you give, us an audience, I mean, our audience an idea of what were those little things, little actions that you started to do to rip off that mask?
Yeah, and I think so. Part of it was starting to talk about more queer texts that
Mm,
were available in the library and that were there, but the kids didn't know about. And so I often talked about one of my favorite ones is by Benjamin Alire Sanz, which is Dante and Aristotle discover the secrets of the universe.
love it.
It's so beautiful. It's a beautiful story. And I often, whenever we talk about, I was an ELA teacher, so whenever I talked about what was my favorite book, I always uplifted that one as a way to say, like, there these texts exist and started to open up conversations around that. And then at the same time, um, when I was teaching some texts and the conversation around queerness came up, I didn't shy away from it as much as I did in my earlier part of my teaching career, where I would literally just say, like, that's just not appropriate to talk about right now. Versus like actually just like getting into the difficult conversation. And like one really good example was when I taught eighth grade ELA, we read The Great Gatsby. And The Great Gatsby, actually, the character is not explicitly queer. Like, it's not said explicitly here, but somebody brought it up.
Mhm.
Like, I think the character might be gay. And in the past, I'd be like, I don't know, I don't have this conversation. But actually, we ended up talking about it. And and I always say, like, we have to give the youth credit because the youth are really good at
Yes.
not even just navigating the conversation, but also just like being um, really humane citizens. Like then it became a conversation around like who cares, like who cares in terms of like oh we should erase that, but it's just like they're just regular people too. And it was just such a great conversation and space to have with the youth. And so I started doing small things like that. Eventually, by the fourth or fifth year, I had that conversation with my mentor. My classroom was a very vibrant space, and I noticed the difference of when I was open and authentic about it at the start
Mm.
versus like opening it up over time. There was like a stark difference in classroom culture and the way students were talking to each other and the way that they advocate for each other.
That's Dr. Zarate. No, Dr. Dre. Wait a
Yes.
minute, we already have a Dr. Dre, right?
Yeah.
That's also so powerful because, excuse me, we think about the student as a learner.
Yes.
And I'm not referring to just, elementary, middle, high school, secondary, post-secondary. I'm also talking about anyone that is in a learning environment, right? And how it is so important for us to see them and for them
Mhm.
to see us, right? And
Right.
so the very moment that we're being inauthentic as the learning facilitator is the very wall that prevents the learner from truly engaging. And I'm not, obviously, it can happen regardless, but we create so much more authentic classroom learning spaces when we are stepping into our true selves. And that resonates with me just simply because that's exactly what happened to me. I eventually became more comfortable. I don't know if I ever told you this, but I was also an ELA teacher, right?
Mhm.
And so the opportunity to have these Socratic conversations with brilliant middle schoolers that were pulling, extrapolating, you know, things from the text that I, as late 20s, early 30s, had not even considered was
Right.
one. I, I don't know if I'm going to be completely transparent. Like that may have been a little embarrassed. It's like, why didn't I think of that? I'm the teacher,
Yeah.
right? And so the idea of being able to create those learning spaces where students are connected to the facilitator, but they're also engaging in their own learning about the text and also the world in which we exist. But I want to say this. I have to ask this question. You
Mhm.
told us a story about presenting texts and books to certain, you know, in certain situations. But that was then.
Right.
We don't have that type of, in most cases, that type of autonomy as teachers anymore, as learning facilitators, to select texts that might be viewed as controversial. So, what advice would you give to um, a queer learning facilitator who is teaching today in a middle school or elementary or high school level, where that can be a particularly touchy subject, or just flat out in certain states illegal? What
Right.
advice?
Yeah, so one of the things I have constantly talked about, and one of the things that I have been a part of, is what are some ways that you can offer as an educator resources and even like providing that third space where
Mhm.
they could have those conversations. And so I am fully aware that, I mean, I was lucky and privileged to be in a school context where those texts were allowed to be used and allowed to be talked about. And at the same time, I recognize that I have a lot of teacher educator friends who are afraid to, particularly with the rise of book bans across the country that continue to rise every month. Um, Based on the different political climates that are happening throughout the United States. And so, what we often talk about is how do you create those third spaces? And so, one of the things that me and my mentor, Caroline Hill from the Teach It Accelerator, do is we host banned books in the metaverse where people can log on and we read excerpts of banned book text and have the conversations around. Or what themes come up in the text, but also like how do you bring this to the classroom space if they're not able to. And so one good example is like creating those spaces outside of the school context. I would also um, push for, there's always room, like when people, we talk about teaching ELA and text, people think about it in like the whole book context, like, oh, you have to read the
Mhm.
entire book in the unit, but there's also power in excerpts,
Yes.
where you can read excerpts that at least allow youth to be exposed to the book in a way that's like, oh, we're gonna read this portion of the book, and it gives them a little bit of a spark or a catalyst to read the book outside of um, the school context. But my favorite advice to educators is I believe that libraries are spaces of liberation. And I always encourage educators to see what their local libraries are doing. In most cases, local libraries are very positive around banned books and LGBTQ text and things like that. And so I think that's important to uplift as well.
And so when you think about today's context of, don't say gay legislation sweeping the country and being institutionalized in states, how do you, doctor, stay motivated in
Mhm.
this work? And when I say work, I don't mean like literally your work, but the work of being out and proud and walking in your truth and being unapologetic about it.
Mhm. It's so interesting because I definitely had this conversation with somebody yesterday. I did this morning as well around, there's so much noise going on right now. It's so easy to be discouraged.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's so easy to feel like we're losing. It feels that way. But um, what gives me hope is seeing the different types of work out there that is like trying to push against it, trying to resist. And I also, to your point around the more that I started to show up authentically as myself, I started to realize how much joy I found in my own life and in the way that I show up in my work.
Hmm.
Because hiding and not being myself is stressful in many ways. Like you're trying to be somebody that you're not, and you're trying to navigate which in many places, like it's a real thing to navigate where you want to be safe as well. Like there's a level of belonging that you need to feel in order to show up as yourself. But like I've also started to recognize that, life is short, and there needs to be room for me to grow as a human being and to grow in my definition of queerness and to think about it as expansive in all the possibilities that it can be. And I'm still on that journey. And so I think that really excites me about this work is that it's never static, it's dynamic, it's constantly growing and changing.
Yeah. I think that's a very appropriate transition into thinking about and asking you about your leadership journey as a queer out and proud leader.
Mhm.
Where do you see yourself transitioning into now that you are officially doctor as of what? It's been 2 weeks, 3 weeks
Yeah,
now?
yeah, they have 2 or 3 weeks.
Right. So where does this journey take you, and how does that connect to the idea of leading out and proud?
Yeah, so I think what I want to see, I really do want to see myself as somebody who is a part of this movement and who's trailblazing, particularly around the notions of queer youth of color in educational spaces. Like I said before, like I had a vision of opening a school that centered queer youth of color and the just giving space for the exploration of identity that had no boundaries, particularly in thinking about this in the humanities context. And so I think I always try to think about my work as being a healing in practice. It's
Mhm.
more than just um, I'm just putting myself out there, but I also know that this work is healing me and healing others at the same time. And I'm constantly thinking about how, in order to do that work, I do have to heal myself first so I can heal others, and then free myself first so that I can free others. And so that's how I'm actually seeing myself over the next 5 years is like, how can I continue to lead as out and proud? And I try to lead with that first. Like I try to lead with like who I am and who I am authentically, so that people know that it's a safe space to be who you are whenever you're around me.
Yeah, I love that. That's absolutely beautiful. And I know you're going to do great things because you've already done great things. So you will continue. And I'm also thinking about your path, your journey, and the people that you've met along the way, and the people that you will meet as you continue. What do you think? What is something about you that the people that you've interacted with wouldn't know? What would surprise them? What is it that not necessarily you've worn a mask about, but just they may not know about you that we might find intriguing as it relates to being an out and proud leader?
hmm I think one of the biggest comments that I've gotten in the last year and a half is around how vulnerable and authentic I am to my story and to like how I show up as myself. I get a lot of compliments around that, especially like even in the dissertation, I was very vulnerable about like my own personal story. I always lead with that when I talk about why I do this work.
Mhm.
Um, and people always say like, "Oh, you're so confident," and even in public speaking is not my thing. Like, wasn't my thing. When I was younger, I used to be called mute. They used to tell my parents that I never participate.
Mm.
Uh, and people wouldn't know that about me now. And so I think it's just part of the journey is like finding your voice and finding that your voice matters and your story matters. And so um, I often try to share with youth that like the person that I am today came with a lot of pain and hardship and tragedy and disappointments. But what I will say is that I got to find community and people who love and care about me and support me that allowed me to be authentically who I am today and allow me to do the work that I can do today in the education field. Yeah, I think also you had mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to like add on to like roles of youth in the classroom. Like there is often this hierarchy around like the teacher is the expert and the students are the ones that just like they just take in. But one thing
Mhm.
that I really learned in again in the queer Filipinx space that I was in is that a question that I have coming out of it is like, how do we truly flatten the hierarchy and allow youth to be experts in the classroom? And so, like, all the experience and knowledge they bring outside of the school that they bring into the classroom is valid knowledge. And how, as an educator, do you step back, cede some power, and learn from their experiences as well? And so, something that I'm really interested in looking at moving forward is particularly around queer youth trying to identify or to trying to explore queerness. I learned a lot from the queer youth that I was in. Like they kind of taught me how to exist differently than I had thought before. And that is like in their right, they're experts. And it made me allow me to situate myself in the space as also a learner and not I'm the expert of queerness, I'm the expert of Filipinxness, I'm the expert of all of these things. And so it's something that I'm continually trying to grapple with as I move forward and continue to do this work.
So, what does that mean in terms of the classroom itself for you as a leader? What does that look like? Make it tangible for the listener.
Yeah, so I think one of the things is how do we make a lot of the learning in the classroom inquiry based?
Mhm.
I'm so used to, and until recently, like I'm so used, we get the unit plans and we get all the things and we're just like follow it, follow it, follow it. But
Mhm.
there's a way that you can take some of those things and the themes that are being taught in texts and pose them as inquiry. Like, what are some inquiry questions that we can do together? Like, this is the topic. What are some questions that you have? And allow students to um, organically come up with the questions, and then also just be critical of what the texts bring. And so, framing it more as an inquiry allows youth to be more invested in trying to find the knowledge and learn the knowledge, but also like it situates them as the experts at the end rather than me just being like, here is what you need to know and memorize this and all of that. So,
Which we know now is not an effective instructional method for many of the kids in which we've been charged to, support. And when I say kids, this is a broader conversation about the learner and the learning facilitator, the teacher. And so that also applies to adults, much older folks like us, right? So and it, the reason I posited that question because I was hoping that you would mention, something like PBL or exploratory
yeah.
or experiential learning opportunities for students to truly explore what interests them And I love how you said it. They are the expert of what they know, right?
Right. Right.
And most kids, I there's plenty of evidence to suggest and show that our schools today have a tendency to dampen the curiosity that is innate
Yep.
in most humans, right? So how then do we recreate that space in an equitable way where that they can actually take charge of their learning experiences, not just young folks, not just the young learners, but older folks as well.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And it requires a level of self introspection as an educator around, because it is hard, because you go through schooling where you just constantly are being told that you are in charge of the classroom, you're this and that, which is all true legally,
Mhm.
and all those things. But when we're talking about learning spaces, like being able to cede power to this understanding that and I talk about this in my dissertation as well, is that learning is not linear. Like it's not this like point A to point B. Like you can go
Mhm.
from point A to point B to point C and go back to point B, and then they'll figure out how to get to point D. Like we have to remember that learning cycles are cyclical, and just because they answer an edX ticket at the end of the lesson, which I think it's important to assess. Like I'm not saying it's not important to assess. What I'm saying is that I feel like, and I think about this in terms of our identity too. Like we
Mhm.
think our identity journeys are linear. They're not. Like we are constantly going through different cycles. And I think that's the same thing with learning, is
Mhm.
that we are going to go through different cycles, and it's okay if we go backwards for a hot second and we can move forward again later. So I think there's a lot to be said about learning and our identity journeys, or how parallel they are,
Mhm.
and how that could be useful in those spaces.
Well, I really appreciate this space that you've created for us to have today, in being transparent and vulnerable. I do have one last question, and I'd have to thank you for helping me shape this question.
Yeah.
And so it is, what type of world do you dream of that includes LGBTQ community plus community that's completely accepting? And what does the world look like to unlock that potential?
Right. I'm going to respond to that question by like kind of like taking what some of the youth said in their
Mhm.
responses, because it's actually what I think about pretty often, which is I want us to get to a place where the labeling isn't as important,
Mm.
because we can get to a space where I hate using the word normal, and I know the youth don't like using the word normal, but we want to get to a space where not everything is about fragmentation and its parts. We're just kind of like existing, and we can love who we want to love, and we can be who we want to be without having to constantly think about what are other people going to think about us, and how are we going to show up in this space? Are we going to lose our jobs? Are we going to cause these conflicts? I think we can get to that place. I think it's possible. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think about these ideas around collectivism, where I think at the basic level, it's like it's about humanity and how much that we love and care for each other, and that everybody deserves to live a life to their fullest potential. And so that's how I hope to see in the future um, that integration, that level of integration for ourselves. But for now, we'll take small wins after small wins and continue to push forward in that way.
Love that. And I think that's a beautiful note for us to end on. So
Yeah.
thank you
Thank you
for
so
being a part of the
much.
conversation. And
Yes.
we'll definitely be in touch.
Yes. Thank you for
Thank
having me.
you. Take care.